By the winter of 1886, the trail crossing at Vermilion Notch had already taken 11 lives since October. Nobody bothered sending word to the families anymore. The mountains kept their own records, and they settled accounts in the spring. Nora Callahan knew that arithmetic better than most. She had grown up watching her father read the sky the way other men read scripture, with reverence and the quiet understanding that argument was useless. At 24, she carried that same knowledge in her bones, the kind that doesn't come from books, but from years of watching what the land does to people who stop paying attention. She had been riding the supply trace south from Deadwood for 3 days when the sky above the Wyoming high country did something she had never seen it do before. It didn't darken. It simply stopped. The clouds pressed themselves flat against the ridgeline and went the color of old pewter, and the wind, which had been cutting steady out of the northwest since morning, died in an instant. So complete, it felt like the world had swallowed its own breath. Her mare, Thistle, stopped without being asked. The horse planted all 4 hooves in the frozen ruts of the trail and raised her head toward the north. Her ears moved forward, then went completely flat against her skull. She did not sidestep or toss her head the way a young animal would. She simply stood there and refused, the way only an old animal that has already survived one terrible thing understands how to refuse. Nora stood up in the stirrups and looked north. The storm wall stretched the full width of the horizon, black across the top, where it still held its shape, gray underneath, where it had already given up and dissolved into moving curtains of snow traveling sideways across the ground. Beneath those curtains, the high meadows had disappeared entirely. Not faded, disappeared. She had perhaps 90 minutes, possibly less. There was no town within reach. The nearest line camp sat 14 miles east, which meant 14 miles of open, exposed ridge, with nothing between her and that approaching wall. She did not calculate this as a possibility. She dismissed it immediately and completely, the way her father had taught her to dismiss anything that sounded like hope, dressed up as a plan. Nora stepped down from Thistle and stood in the sudden, strange silence of the notch. The cold had a texture now, something thick moving inside it, the kind of cold that didn't just press against skin but worked inward toward the places that kept a person alive. She did not look for a cabin. She did not look for timber. She looked at the ground. There was a particular skill her father had called the second look, the discipline of forcing yourself to see what was actually in front of you rather than what you expected to find. Most people looked at broken country and saw broken country. Her father had looked at broken country and seen geometry, angles, depth, exposure, the direction a surface faced, relative to the wind. Nora had inherited that eye the way other daughters inherited their mother's hair color. It was simply part of how she was put together. She turned slowly and studied the terrain around Vermilion Notch with that second look. The trail fell away to the east, across open ground. Useless. To the west, a shallow coulee cut down toward the creek bottom, but its mouth opened directly into the northwest. The storm would roll straight into it like water down a drain. South offered nothing but more open ridge. And then she turned northeast, toward a broken shoulder of dark sandstone that jutted out from the hillside maybe 200 yards off the trail. The rock formation sat low and heavy, scarred by old weather, into a configuration that most travelers would have ridden past without a second thought. From the trail, it looked like nothing. A heap of stone, a feature of no particular consequence. But Nora could see that one section of the formation curved inward beneath a natural shelf of overhanging rock, creating a recess that faced southeast, away from the direction the storm was coming. The opening was perhaps 12 feet wide. Not deep enough to call a cave, more like a wound in the rock that the hillside had never bothered closing. She thought about what her father used to say while they patched the sod roof of their homestead every autumn before the first freeze. He would hand her the cut blocks of dried prairie grass and press each one tight against the last, working along the edge of the roof frame with an unhurried precision that drove her brothers half mad with impatience. "Nora," he would say, without looking up, "cold doesn't kill through walls. Cold kills through the spaces between walls. You can live inside a paper house if there's nothing left for the cold to travel through." She had been 12 years old. She had pressed the next block into place without answering, understanding already that he was not looking for a response. He was placing information inside her the same careful way he placed sod blocks against the roof frame, building something that would hold when the season changed. Now she looked at the sandstone recess and understood what her father had actually been describing all those years ago. He had not been talking about roofing. He had been talking about the nature of cold itself, the way it moved, the way it needed passage. She led Thistle northeast through the broken sage and frozen grass. The recess was better than it had appeared from the trail. The sandstone floor inside was dry. No standing ice. No loose shelving rock above the overhang. The curve of the walls caught the interior space and held it apart from the open air outside, in a way she could feel immediately, a sense of compressed stillness, as though the rock itself had been gathering patience here for years and was now waiting to see what use she would make of it. 3 walls already given to her by the earth. Nora looked back toward the trail. Then she looked at what she had carried out of deadwood. The supply load strapped across Thistle's back was not what she had set out with 3 days ago. She had traded half her original cargo at a ranch along the way. 2 rolls of grade canvas, a case of lamp oil, a set of iron hardware for goods that paid better on delivery. What remained was a bedroll, a food sack, her rifle case, a bundle of cured hides she was hauling south for a saddler in Cheyenne, and the thing that had seemed most worthless of the entire load when she'd packed it back in Deadwood. A sheet of milled lumber, 8 feet by 4, cracked along one edge and warped from sitting too long in a leaking warehouse. The saddler had asked her to haul it as a favor to a friend who couldn't be bothered to send his own wagon. She had taken it mostly out of politeness. She stood and looked at that plank of warped, cracked, secondhand lumber for a long moment. Then she looked at the open mouth of the recess. 8 feet. The opening was just under 8 feet wide. Nora untied the plank from Thistle's load and leaned it against the sandstone wall. Then she pulled the bundle of cured hides loose and set them on the ground beside it. The hides were heavy, densely rolled, and stiff with the cold. Each one represented roughly 100 miles of trail freight and the quiet, steady work of the dead season. She had been careful with them. They were worth more than anything else she carried. She looked at the hides and then at the gap between the plank and the rock wall on the left side of the opening. The gap was exactly the width of one unrolled hide. Nora Callahan had always been the kind of woman who found dark humor in the timing of necessary sacrifices. She allowed herself exactly 1 second of it. A single short breath that wasn't quite a laugh, and then she got to work. She drove the plank upright across the center of the opening first, wedging its base into a crack in the sandstone floor and bracing its upper edge beneath a lip of the overhang. The warped middle section bowed inward slightly, which was actually better than she'd hoped. It pressed naturally against the rock on one side, rather than pulling away from it. The first gust of returning wind arrived while she was still working. Not the full storm. A scout. A cold tongue of moving air that rolled across the notch and pressed against her back like a hand checking the temperature of a door before opening it. She worked faster. The cured hides went over the left gap first. One hide unrolled and pressed tight against the plank edge, then folded back against the inner sandstone wall and weighted down with a flat rock from the floor. The second hide went over the upper gap between the plank and the overhang, stuffed tight into the space and anchored with her bedroll rope lashed twice around a knob of protruding rock. The right side was harder. The space between the plank and the sandstone curved away at an awkward angle, leaving a gap that no single flat surface could close without tearing. Nora stood with her hands on her hips for 3 seconds, exactly 3, the way she had learned to stop and think before acting when the situation outpaced her first instinct. She pulled her father's old saddle blanket from beneath the bedroll. It was the one thing she had never traded, never considered trading, a thick double-woven wool blanket, so old the pattern had worn smooth in the center, but still carried the weight and density of something made to last through decades. She had told herself for years that she kept it for practical reasons. It was warm. It packed flat. It was already paid for. She pressed the blanket into the right gap and worked the edges into the crack between the plank and the curved sandstone wall with her fingertips, forcing the wool deep into the uneven surface the way her father had mortared sod blocks. Every inch of the edge mattered. Every inch she left unsealed was a path the cold could follow inside. When she stepped back to look at what she had built, the first real wind of the coming storm hit the notch like a fist. The plank shuddered. The upper hide flapped once and went taut against the rope. A thin white line of wind-blown snow appeared along the top seam of the right side and swept sideways across the interior floor in a single narrow stream before Nora dropped to one knee and pushed the blanket edge deeper into the crack with both thumbs. The stream vanished. She worked along the full base of the structure on her knees after that, pressing frozen dirt and small sharp fragments of sandstone grit into every gap where the plank base met the uneven floor. Her fingers went past cold into that particular category of painlessness that was itself a warning, but she kept pressing and packing until she could no longer feel any air moving against the side of her face when she held her cheek close to the ground seams. Then she stood and looked at the shelter from inside. No line of gray sky showed through the joints. No cold current touched her neck or her hands when she held still. The space inside the recess had changed. It felt separate now from the wind building outside. Not warm. Stillness is not warmth. But the air was no longer moving, and for the first time since Thistle stopped on the trail above, Nora felt the smallest loosening of something tight in the center of her chest. She brought Thistle inside last. The mare had stood ground-tied in the building wind without pulling loose, which was exactly the kind of steadiness that made Thistle worth more to Nora than any other single thing she owned. Nora guided the horse through the narrow gap she had left on the right side, pulling the saddle blanket back just enough for Thistle to pass, then pressing it back into place the moment the horse was through. Thistle's body heat hit the sealed air of the recess immediately. Not warmth exactly, more like the memory of warmth. A living thing in a sealed space is a furnace by comparison to stone and frozen dirt, and the change was something Nora could feel along the surface of her own skin. The way the cold slowly stopped taking and started only waiting, she finished sealing the right side from the inside, working the blanket edge back into the crack, and pressing a final layer of sandstone grit along the base seam. When she was done, she stood still in the dark interior and ran her eyes along every joint of the structure she had built. One thin point of gray light still showed in the upper left corner, where the hide met the overhang. Nora reached up and pressed the hide flat against the rock with both palms and held it there. The gray line disappeared. She held the hide in place until the cold drove deep enough into her palms that she had to pull them back. Then she folded the top edge of the hide back on itself and wedged the doubled thickness into the crack. The gray was gone. The storm arrived the way her father had always said the worst ones arrived. Not gradually, not with courtesy. It came across the ridge like the whole of the northern sky had decided to change direction and simply moved. The first full impact shook the plank in its crack hard enough that Nora threw one arm against it from inside, bracing the wood with her shoulder while the wind drove against the outer face with a sustained pressure that was not wind in the usual sense, but something closer to weight. The structure groaned. The upper hide cracked against its rope binding. Outside, the sound was not howling. Howling implies a pitch, a frequency, something the human ear can categorize and file. This sound was lower and less forgiving, a deep, broad collision of cold air with stone that seemed to come from every direction at once. Then the pressure steadied. And Nora realized, standing with her shoulder against the shuddering plank in the sealed dark of the sandstone recess, that the structure was not trying to resist the storm. It was simply giving it nothing to enter. Her father's voice again, unprompted, arriving in her memory the way useful things often did in moments when she had stopped trying to think and started only listening. Cold kills through the spaces between walls. She had built a wall with no spaces, or close enough to none that the storm couldn't find its way through. That was the only requirement. It did not need to be beautiful. It did not need to be warm. It needed to be closed. Hours moved in, the way time moves inside a sealed dark space during a storm. Not in minutes, but in sounds. The quality of wind against stone. The rhythm of Thistle's breathing shifting from anxious and quick to slow and deep. The small sounds of the structure settling under sustained pressure. The tiny adjustments of wood against rock, hide against hide, rope fiber stretching and holding. Around what Nora judged to be the middle of the night, the upper hide worked itself partially loose from its rope binding. She heard it before she felt it. A sudden sharp crack overhead, followed by a thin horizontal scream of cold air cutting across the interior at face height. The draft hit her directly across the bridge of her nose, cold enough to feel like touching iron in January. Nora climbed to her feet in complete darkness and reached for the rope by feel alone. Her fingers found the knot on the third search. It had not broken the force of the wind, had simply worked the hide up along the rope until the binding had slipped to the wrong point on the rolled edge. She pulled the hide back down against the overhang with both hands, holding it flat with the weight of her upper body while she worked the rope around a better section of the rolled edge. The wind pushed back against her from outside with a steady, impersonal force, the way water pushes against a dam without interest in the dam's opinion of the matter. She tied the knot twice, then a third time. Then she found the gap the escape draft had opened along the upper seam and packed it with the last loose material. She had a strip of canvas lining torn from the inside of her rifle case, pushing it tight into the crack with the blade of her knife handle until the interior air went still, again. She stood in the dark, with her back against the sandstone wall, and breathed. Outside, something extraordinary was happening, though she would only understand it fully hours later. The storm, which had been battering the exposed face of the plank with direct force, was now driving loose snow so thickly against the outer surface of the shelter that the snow itself was sealing the remaining micro-gaps from outside. The cracks she couldn't reach from inside were being filled by the storm's own material. Powder snow packed into spaces no human finger could have pressed tight. Ice crystals, bridging seams that the wind itself had created. Layer by layer, the blizzard was helping close the thing it was trying to break open. The deep pressure against the shelter gradually changed in character. It became less a series of impacts and more a single, sustained weight, even, heavy, and consistent. Nora pressed one hand flat against the plank and felt the vibration in the wood change from a tremor to a dull thrum to, eventually, almost nothing at all. The snow building against the outer face had reached a depth where the plank itself was no longer receiving direct wind. It was receiving the weight of a drift. The shelter had been buried. What should have killed her was insulating her. She slept some time after that. Not deeply. The kind of sleep that stays close to the surface, aware of sound while the conscious part of the mind rests. She woke twice, once when Thistle shifted position with a long, slow breath that fogged the sealed air visibly even in the near-total dark, and once when a new sound reached her from outside. Faint, distant, almost musical. The sound of wind moving across the top of a snowdrift rather than against it, a smooth, frictionless sound instead of the earlier grinding impact. The storm had crested and was descending the other side. Nora lay still in the dark for a long time after that, and did not think about the storm, or the shelter, or the cured hides she had sacrificed to the gaps along the structure's edges. She thought about the supply contract that had brought her out of Deadwood in the first place. She thought about the saddler in Cheyenne, who would receive his cracked lumber late, assuming she could dig it out from under the drift and get it remounted on Thistle's load in the morning. She thought about the way frozen trails look in the early light after a heavy snowfall, when the old ruts are gone and the country looks unused, as if nobody had ever crossed it before, and it falls to whoever is standing there at that particular moment to decide where the path runs. The gray line reappeared along the top of the shelter before she expected it. Not the pale, false gray of deep cloud cover, but a lighter, cleaner gray, the gray that came before actual color returned to the world. Nora sat up against the sandstone wall and watched the line grow until she was certain of what it meant. She began dismantling the shelter from the inside out. The upper hide came down first. Ice had fused part of its edge to the overhang surface overnight, and she had to work the bond loose carefully rather than pulling, saving the hide from tearing if she could. The saddle blanket came away from the right gap in one piece, still folded at the center where she had pressed it in, carrying the impression of the crack in its weave like a cast of the space it had sealed. When Nora pulled the plank free from its base crack and leaned it sideways, the exterior world arrived all at once. Cold air, clean and motionless. White light without a source. And silence of a completeness that was not the silence of absence, but the silence of aftermath. The particular quiet that exists in the space a great destructive thing leaves behind once it has finished. The drift against the outer face of the shelter reached to the top of the overhang. The plank had been buried to half its height. Looking at the outer surface, Nora could see the place where the storm had done its sealing work. a smooth, continuous line of packed snow and ice, bridging the upper seam so seamlessly it looked deliberately applied. The blizzard had caulked its own entry points closed. She stood in the opening of the recess for a moment before stepping out. The sandstone walls on either side of her were dark and solid and indifferent in the way that old stone is always indifferent, which is not the same as hostile. The rock had not protected her out of any concern for her welfare. She had used the rock the way her father had taught her to use every feature of difficult country, not as refuge given freely, but as material available to those who looked at it with clear eyes and understood what they were looking at. Thistle stepped out beside her and stopped. The mare raised her head and breathed in the stillness. The white cloud of her breath hung suspended in the frozen air for longer than seemed possible, as if the cold itself was uncertain how to absorb it. The notch had been rearranged by the storm. The freight trail was gone entirely, buried under smooth white drifts that curved and rose in shapes that had nothing to do with the original contours of the ground beneath. The sage flats to the south were a blank surface. The ridgeline to the north had been softened into pale arching forms. Nothing moved anywhere in the landscape. Nora turned back and looked at what remained of the shelter. The plank leaned against the sandstone wall beside the recess opening, one edge crusted with ice. The original crack along its length, now packed with frozen grit and snow that would take spring thaw to dislodge. The cured hides lay folded beside it, ice stiff, but intact. The saddle blanket held its shape in the cold like a piece of carved material, still carrying the pressed impression of the crack it had sealed through the night. A buyer in Cheyenne would look at the hides and see a few dollars less than their value because of the handling. The saddler would receive his cracked lumber and say nothing either way. Thistle would need a full day's rest before covering serious miles again. The trail south would take longer to navigate post-storm than it would have before. None of those things were problems. They were simply the next set of conditions to be read and responded to. That was what her father had meant, she understood now, by the second look. Not that you looked at broken country and found it beautiful. Not that you found hidden gifts in difficulty, which was a comfortable story people told themselves when they'd never faced the real kind. What he had meant was simpler and harder than that. You looked at what was actually in front of you. You named it correctly, and then you used it. Nora loaded Thistle's pack slowly and methodically, placing each item with the care of someone who understood that weight distribution on a long trail in post-storm conditions was a question that mattered. She reattached the plank last, lashing it across the load the same way it had been lashed when she left Deadwood. Same position, same knots. Same cracked, warped, secondhand piece of milled lumber that a man in a leaking warehouse had deemed barely worth the freight cost. She led Thistle south through the new snow, breaking her own trail where the old one had gone under the drifts. It took her 2 more days to reach Cheyenne. The country between Vermilion Notch and the Wyoming Basin had taken the storm hard. She passed 2 abandoned freight rigs in the first morning. Both left where their drivers had decided the going was too much. One tipped sideways in a coulee, one simply stopped in the middle of the trail with its load still roped in place, as if the driver had stepped down for a moment and not returned. Recovery crews were working the higher ground before noon, moving slowly through the drifts, with a purpose that required no explanation. By the time Nora rode into the freight yard in Cheyenne on the afternoon of the 3rd day, news of the storm had already rearranged the whole conversation of the town. Men stood at the edge of the yard and recounted the death toll, the way people recounted things that had already become part of a fixed record. The blizzard had been severe enough that its name would attach to a year and become a reference point, the winter of the Vermilion Storm, the season of the Notch Crossing. Her contact at the freight office, a heavy-set man named Dorsey who had been moving Wyoming cargo for 30 years, looked at her from across the yard with an expression she had seen on exactly 2 other faces in her life, both of them during situations involving the kind of luck that had no reasonable explanation. He walked toward her without speaking until he was close enough that she could see him making the calculation alive. Upright, cargo intact, a horse in acceptable shape, before his face settled into something less dramatic and more professional. "You came through the notch," he said. It was not a question. Nora handed him the freight manifest. "I came through the notch." He looked down at the paper for a moment without reading it. 3 teams tried to outrun it east. 2 rigs went under on the Laramie grade. Bartlett's crew holed up in that old stone relay station and lost 2 horses to the cold. He looked up. Nothing came through from the north until you. Nora began unsaddling Thistle while he talked. She pulled the cinch loose and lifted the saddle clear and set it on the fence rail and worked her hands along the mare's back in long, steady strokes the way she always did after a hard run. Thistle stood without moving, warm and present, and entirely unconcerned with the larger implications of her own survival. "What did you shelter in?" Dorsey asked. "There's nothing at Vermilion Notch. I've ridden that trail 50 times. Nora looked over her shoulder at the load still strapped across the horse. The cracked lumber lay on top, visible and unglamorous. A piece of material that had served one purpose in a warehouse, and a different one on a sandstone floor in a Wyoming blizzard. Sandstone recess, northeast side of the notch, she said. About 200 yards off the trail. Nothing up there big enough to call shelter. It was big enough for what I needed. She kept working along Thistle's back. 3 walls already there. I built the 4th. Dorsey was quiet for a moment. She could feel him processing this the way practical men processed information that contradicted their existing categories. Not with disbelief exactly, but with the particular resistance of someone who would need to rebuild a mental map. "Out of what?" he finally said. Nora nodded toward the freight load. "That lumber you asked me to carry. Some hides. My father's old blanket." Another pause. "The 4th wall was a warped piece of secondhand pine." "The 4th wall was whatever I had," Nora said. "That's all it ever needs to be." She turned back to Thistle and kept working, and after a moment she heard Dorsey's boots on the frozen yard dirt moving away toward the office, slow and unhurried, the walk of a man who had just been given something to think about for longer than the current afternoon. The story of Nora Callahan and the Vermilion Notch crossing moved through Wyoming freight culture the way such stories always moved, not in newspapers, not in official accounts, but in the specific oral tradition of people who worked difficult country and understood that the knowledge most worth carrying was the knowledge that kept a person alive when the documented methods ran out. Teamsters repeated it at way stations along the Laramie grade. Freight women, and there were more of them than the Eastern papers ever acknowledged, mentioned it in the practical shorthand of their trade when the subject of mountain storms came up. Men who had known her father remembered it as confirmation of something they had long suspected about where a person's real education came from. The details shifted over time, in the way details always shift, when stories travel by word of mouth. Some versions said she built an entire cabin wall from the lumber. Some said she was caught in the storm for 4 days instead of 1 night. One version, which persisted longer than the others, claimed she had no horse at all and carried Thistle's warmth only in memory. But every version ended the same way. She had looked at a piece of broken ground and a piece of cracked lumber and a storm bearing down from the north, and she had not wished for a different situation, or waited for a better solution, or spent the 90 minutes she had trying to outrun something that could not be outrun. She had looked at what was in front of her, actually in front of her, not the version she wished was there, and she had named it correctly. A recess. A plank. 3 walls already given. Space for 1 more. And in the mountain country, that kind of seeing lasted longer than the people who practiced it. It traveled forward through the years in the mouths of practical people, tested by weather rather than opinion, passed from freight yard to way station to the ears of whoever needed it next, which was always someone, because the storms that came across Vermilion Notch were not a historical peculiarity. They were a permanent feature of the country. And the country did not ask whether you were ready. It only asked whether you could look at what you had and understand what it was for. Nora didn't survive because she was stronger than the storm, or luckier than the men who didn't make it through. She survived because her father had quietly placed something inside her, year by year, the way a good person builds anything that lasts without rushing, without fanfare, just pressing each piece tight against the last, until the whole thing holds. The tools we inherit from the people who loved us rarely look like gifts when we're carrying them. They look like old blankets. They look like secondhand lumber. They look like an ordinary habit of seeing clearly. But on the night the storm arrives, you'll know exactly what they were for. A small note for you: this story was crafted and fictionalized by AI, offered here for your entertainment and in the quiet hope that somewhere inside it, you found something true enough to carry forward.